Friends and viewers of Gens Italia, welcome to a new episode of our series of in-depth discussions on geopolitics, as well as on history and society, as in today's episode where I have the great pleasure of being able to talk with Fausto Biloslavo, who, in addition to being a well-known journalist and correspondent on multiple war fronts around the world, is also the author of a series of publications, articles, as well as actual books, which take us back to his place of origin, to our place of origin. That is, to put it in broader terms, the northeastern border of Italy. In some way, Trieste is all the complex history behind it. Above all, the book Verità Infoibate comes to mind, but of course there are a whole series of other publications. So Fausto, first of all, thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
In this 2026, the year's mark, what is the theme of today's episode? The 80th anniversary of the Vergarolla Massacre. I think we can define it, to give a general overview, as one of the biggest massacres in Italy's history since the post-war period, without fear of contradiction, right?
Fausto, yes, the bloodiest in terms of victims, because there were over 100. The exact number is uncertain, because some bodies simply vanished, and among them were many children as well. So yes, that's another aspect to highlight. So of all the Italian massacres, this was the first after the war and the bloodiest.
Among all the massacres after the war, this was the first and the bloodiest. It means that despite, the years of lead, Bologna, none of those massacres caused as many deaths as Vergarolla, as many wounded as Vergarolla. This is an interesting point, an important one to start from. Also because there was a silence that, let's say, fell over this event and lasted for too long. We can say for a long time. It's true that I don't know if you've ever been to the places of this catastrophe, but generally people don't even know where it is or what it is. Vergarolla, where is it?
Yes, now, well, even with the associations of the exiles, plaques and memorials have been placed. But from the very beginning, there was a wide effort of misdirection, disinformation, and covering up responsibilities, because the responsibility belonged to Tito's secret police. We'll explain later, maybe in detail, why. But from the very beginning, yes, the official line of the new Yugoslavia. At that time, Pola was under Allied control, so it was not yet part of the biozone, or even less of Yugoslavia, precisely because it was a port, an important port, right at the tip of Istria. No. And I was saying that from the very beginning, the official thesis, the Yugoslav side, was that it was an accident. But in short, everyone knew it wasn't an accident. It was a terrible piece of the strategy of tension and violence applied by Tito, ordered by Tito, which reached its peak with the Foibe, which cost 300,000 to 350,000 Italians to flee. There was the problem of Pola, this important city, which was practically an enclave, almost entirely Italian, and the vast majority of the homes in Pola were Italian. And since it was under British control, obviously Tito's men couldn't move freely like in the rest of Istria, in Zone B, and so on. In short, Venezia, Giulia, Fiume, and Dalmatia. So it's not like they could go there to round people up and throw them into the Foibe. So they invented this territory. A terrible attack, obviously, and they covered it up, not just for half a century, I'd say even more, a century for sure. Anyway, it took a long time, only a few years ago. In short, the truth started to come to light, also thanks to documents from the British Secret Services, and so their work of misdirection. Their official version was that it was an accident. Then, since in fact it was about, maybe we should also explain what it was about, right?
It was about, of course, as we said, on August 18th, 1946, shortly after 2 p.m., on the beach of Vergarolla, where there were sailing and rowing competitions and sports events taking place, there was a tremendous explosion of a pile, a stack of explosives that suddenly...
Well, actually, by the way, in short, everything was organized. Also, due to the fact that every year the population of Pola, that is families with children, just to be clear, it wasn't an event. I don't know, politics, a parade. No, a family with children, they would meet there at Vergarolla near Pola. That you pointed out earlier on the map because there was the patron saints festival. There were these rowing competitions. In short, it was an important city event, a day of total celebration. No.
I absolutely don't show many images of the event because the tyrant algorithm would take them down. It would take everything down. That's it.
And besides, it was also a beautiful sunny day. So, in short, fathers and mothers with their children brought their children. In short, to this moment of, let's call it celebration, of lightheartedness and so on. In short, on the beach of Vergarolla, since the end of the war, there were German naval mines, probably other explosives too, and other devices, but they were completely disarmed, because otherwise they could have exploded earlier, completely disarmed. But as it happens exactly on that summer day in 46, let me emphasize 46 with the war completely over. So absolutely, I don't know. We don't even have any possible quote unquote justification for such an act. Context?
Well, no.
No, the same environment. The war was totally over, finished. Italy had lost. In short, this is the historical situation in precisely the summer of 46. These mines, this explosive, these devices, when the explosive goes off, they blow up and create that mushroom cloud you showed. As you can see, a mushroom cloud over 100 meters high, really a very tall mushroom cloud. But above all, they cause immense devastation on the beach. Because it was an open field, because just imagine the shrapnel, the force of the explosive and so on. In the middle of the Italian crowd, where not only adults are decimated. Here, these are some images, but also so many children, so many boys, girls, teenagers, minors, and so on. In short, in this context, among other things, there is a story within the story, even more damned. Here, I was then showing it in the photograph of the surgeon from Pola, whose name was Micheletti, who was the only surgeon. Then there was his assistant. In short, however, basically when the massacre happened, obviously the hospital closest to that was Pola, and he started operating there, intervening nonstop, trying to save whoever could be saved. At some point, they also involved his children. What's more, his wife also died. His children didn't make it, and he kept intervening, kept operating. So in short,
just to say, we see the news that even his young children at that moment in Vergarolla died. Exactly. He, after a moment of keeps operating for hours and hours. As the director of the International Rescue Committee said, he cuts legs, cuts arms, but saves lives.
Saving so many people. Anyway, by the way, maybe this is less known. There was also a survivor, a lucky one from Vergarolla, who later had a great career in the Alpini and became a general in the Alpini, also with the mission in Mozambique, the mission in Kosovo, and so on, who is General Silvio Mazzaroli, who still lives in Trieste, who remembers very well because he was supposed to go there too as a young boy to Vergarolla that day, like all the families of Pola did, and luckily he had a slight fever, so they kept him at home. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have met General Mazzaroli. In short,
so we mentioned a bit earlier what Pola was like right before the Vergarolla Massacre. We know it had at least 30,000 inhabitants, maybe 32,000, perhaps even a bit more. But what did it represent, in your opinion, for Tito? Pola.
Well, Pola had a practical strategic importance because it was a port right at the tip of Istria. It's no coincidence the Allies wanted control of it. And then it also had, therefore, a military importance and a symbolic importance, because it was, even though the numbers now seem small to us, it was a big city. For that time, for that era, right? Exactly. And above all, it was a city that clearly showed the signs of Italian identity and presence. For example, since the time of the Romans, with the arena of Pola, which still exists today, and then the Venetians, and then Italy, and so on and so on. And so for these two reasons, and also because the vast majority of the population really, in that case, the vast majority of the population was Italian.
Yes, more than anywhere Pola really was.
Yes, exactly. More than Trieste. Yes, obviously, yes, in some ways, obviously, it started as a thorn in the side, as long as it remained under control, allied, and in fact, formally, let's say, still Italian, right? Formally still Italian. So it was a thorn in the side that they couldn't afford, but they couldn't afford to use the strategy of terror with the foibe either, and make the people from Pola flee, maybe having a few thousand thrown into the foibe, a few thousand deported. No. And so, as I said at the beginning, they had to come up with something new. And the secret police, the OSNA, came up with this terrible, terrible massacre. Then, in fact,
Yes, no, even though the people responsible were never found, so to speak, the exact sequence of events was never reconstructed. But it must be said that there, if you didn't go in with a detonator and some know-how, no.
Obviously, but no. But then, a few years ago, some documents came out from the archives of the British Secret Services, who had immediately made investigative reports. It was clear that they not only suspected, but were convinced that it was Tito's secret police. Some names also came out then in the mix of what we now call cognitive warfare. Back then, propaganda and disinformation. Yes, at a certain point, what did they adopt as a new line? The Yugoslavs said, yes, well, sure, without detonators. But then they blamed the Croatian nationalist exiles, the Ustashas, and so on, who in turn supposedly organized this attack to blame Tito's new authorities. In short, a convoluted story, but it held up thanks to propaganda. In short, because of this, Pola, the truth about Pola, was completely uprooted and torn from the pages of history for over half a century. And then instead, in this century, people started to speak clearly. And above all, documents came out that put an end to all doubts, English documents, and they were there. So in short, they were definitely the most reliable sources, which undoubtedly they have. They made it very clear and highlighted that it was not an accident, that it was an attack, and that behind this attack, there was very likely, in fact, Tito's secret police, with the very clear objective, which then happened, of making all the Italians, the population, flee.
That was the objective. Let me pause you. We'll return to this soon. Now we're moving to the conclusion. Let me broaden the view for a moment just to ask you this. In your opinion, looking at how Europe was redesigned starting from the end of the Second World War, and thinking about Pola at first, a section almost like Italy, but separated from the motherland, that is, without territorial continuity. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? Remaining separated like that, it's something that precisely in the logic at the end of the war could not be accepted. Maybe because of the risk of creating a second Danzig. Now I'm exaggerating because Danzig was separated.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I hear you perfectly. Maybe you hear me better now.
A little badly distant, but I can certainly hear you.
This problem of territorial discontinuity, I think that at the end of the war, it was something that was no longer acceptable. In general, yes, exactly.
Of course, in the sense that it was obvious that if a large part of Venezia Giulia, except Trieste, but Trieste was to the west, well, it was under temporary control. I would like to emphasize control. Yugoslav administration, the so-called Zone B, and then most of Istria, Fiume, Dalmatia were already, in fact, annexed also to Zone B. In fact, however, well, there was still this formality of control, this appearance of being temporary. And Pola was a problem. Pola was outside of this zone B, outside of Yugoslavia. And so it needed to be resolved. And in fact, then in 47, there was the London Memorandum and so on. It was resolved in the sense that Trieste remained in zone A. Then there was zone B for the Yugoslavs. And from Pola, the English withdrew. Of course, Pola was defeated. It was abandoned by the English. And it was no coincidence that at the moment when the English had announced they were leaving, the Italian population of Pola, which was the overwhelming majority, Pola was completely emptied. And they fled, mostly boarding the steamship Toscana. And so they were not among the last exiles, but certainly among the last big wave. And once they landed from the Toscana, they arrived in Italy. And this is what the photos refer to as well. Among other things, they said that there weren't even enough nails to close up the apartments and the shops because they couldn't take everything with them, obviously. And even the crates with belongings, they took whatever they could carry. So in short, it was really the last major episode of the Exodus, which involved a kind of ethnic cleansing with the Foibi. And now we know also through the Vergarolla bombing.
Here, there is a connection between the massacre of, as we mentioned, but in short, there is an obvious connection between the Vergarolla massacre and the Polesano exodus, right?
Of course, even though it happened the year before, clearly all Italians suspected that it wasn't an accident. As long as the English were there, things were manageable. But after they left, given the Vergarolla precedent, people thought we might get killed, maybe not. In short,
a climate of fear.
And so they all ran away like the other Italians from Istria, Fiume, and Dalmatia.
Until the very last ones. Then, with the closing of Zone B, meaning the Free Territory, not in 54, but the Capodistria exodus of 53, 54.
Exactly, my grandmother, who was actually in the center of Istria, in Momiano d'Istria, held out until the very end, while the men in the family, including my father, his brothers, and my grandfather, left right after the end of the war when they understood what the situation was. In fact, my grandfather and my uncle even risked being thrown into a foiba, but they managed to escape into the woods. And my grandmother, on the other hand, stayed in the house. Let's say they had the farmhouse, they had the land, they had the animals, which by then had already been divided, nationalized. But then in 1954, when they nationalized even the house, which was later turned into a canoba, into a restaurant. So Trieste returned to Italy, where the rest of the family was already living. And so she was one of the last, if not the very last, exiles from Istria. In short,
these are common stories. My grandmother was from Albona. She almost ended up in the Fianona Foiba, which is down there. Later, she almost hoped to end up under the English for a while because Albona was under Pola, so there was hope as a province, but in the end, no, and she escaped too. In short, like many others, that's how we ended up here. In conclusion, I sincerely thank you, Fausto, for this interesting analysis and in-depth look at recent history. It's something we should always remember, especially in this month, which, let's say, follows the Day of Remembrance. Therefore, the hope is to keep alive the memory of these lands, but above all of these people who remained Italian until the very end.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who is following us. Why is it still necessary today to put back in place pages of history that were deliberately torn out? One of these is definitely the Vergarolla Massacre, shrouded in fog, disinformation, cover-ups, and lies from the very beginning. But it is in fact part of this tragic story of the eastern borders. And with a real strategy of terror, it ethnically cleansed entire areas, territories that were inhabited by Italians who were forced to flee, like Pola. So thank you for not forgetting and for adding pages to history, because we don't need to remove any. in short, if anything to add, because for too long they have been torn away.
Thank you to Fausto, and thank you all for following us. Goodbye.